He ruled at the height of everything. Cronus, king of the Titans, lord of an age the Greeks called golden, presided over a world so full and so ordered that mortals who came after would speak of it the way you speak of something you lost before you were born. The sky obeyed him. The earth gave fruit without labor. Creation itself bent toward his reign. And he was terrified. Not of armies, not of rivals, there were none. His terror had no face, only a voice, a prophecy, spoken like a curse by a father whose power he'd already broken. That a son of his would do to him what he had done. That the throne he stood on was borrowed. That every year of his golden age was only time running down. So he chose a weapon, not a blade, not fire, something more intimate than either, something only he could do. One night, his queen placed something in his open hands, a bundle of cloth, small enough to hold, heavy enough, she knew, to end a dynasty. He looked down at it, and he opened his mouth. Before Cronus ever swallowed anything, someone swallowed him. His father, Uranus, the sky itself, vast and absolute, had done the same thing first. Every child he fathered, shoved back into darkness, buried alive inside their mother Gaia because a father was afraid of what they might become. Gaia bore it until she couldn't. She forged a sickle from adamantine, harder than anything that existed, and asked which of her children was brave enough to use it. One stepped forward. Cronus took it, waited in the dark, and when Uranus descended, he struck. The wound was catastrophic, and in the moment of his agony, Uranus turned toward his son and spoke his only remaining weapon. Your own child will do to you exactly what you have done to me. Cronus heard it as a threat. What he couldn't see, what no one in the moment of triumph ever sees, was that it was a description. He'd just become the first proof of the pattern he was about to spend eternity trying to escape. And for a time, a long, luminous time, it was enough. The world under Cronus was everything the myths promised. Grain came up heavy in the fields without anyone asking it to. Rivers ran cold and clean. The first humans lived without war, without toil, without the slow grief of aging. The Golden Age wasn't a metaphor. It was a fact written into the shape of the world itself, and it lasted as long as Cronus could hold the fear at bay. Then Rhea bore their first child. She was a goddess from the moment of her birth, still, radiant, the kind of presence that fills a room with warmth the way a hearth does. She was Hestia, and Cronus reached out and swallowed her whole. Not in rage. That's what people miss about this. There was no rage in it. Just a god looking at his newborn daughter and seeing, behind her eyes, the outline of everything he stood to lose. His hands closed. Hestia was gone. The second child came, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, of growing things, of the deep patience of the earth. Gone. The third, Hera, already carrying in her infant face the authority of a queen. Gone. Hades followed, and then Poseidon, and each time the pattern was the same. A child born into the world, a moment of held breath, and then those hands closing like a door. Rhea watched all of it. And here's the thing about Rhea that the myth doesn't announce but quietly insists upon. Her grief had a shape. It wasn't despair. It was accumulating, sharpening, turning itself over in the dark into something that looked less and less like suffering and more like a question. Cronus believed each time that he'd won another round. He hadn't understood what kind of opponent he was making. But Rhea couldn't act alone. She went to the only being who had watched this pattern longer than anyone alive, her mother. Gaia, who had endured her own husband's cruelty until she couldn't. The same one who had set all of this in motion. Rhea was going back to the source of the wound, to the person who had first spoken the prophecy that was now eating her children alive. But she wasn't going to grieve. She was going to ask how to fight it. And Gaia knew exactly what to do. She'd been here before. She'd forged the sickle. She'd pointed her son at his own father and said, "End this." The earth had learned, long before anyone else, that the only way to stop a tyrant was to use what he trusted. Cronus trusted Rhea. Completely. Unconditionally. She'd handed him 5 children and he'd never once doubted her. So Rhea wrapped a stone in cloth. Swaddling cloth, the kind a newborn would be wrapped in. And she held it in her arms as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Because the real child was already gone, hidden in a cave somewhere deep in the mountains of Crete, where the sound of his crying would never reach his father. When Cronus reached out his hands, she placed the bundle in them. The stone was small, unremarkable, catastrophic. He swallowed it without hesitation. He believed he'd won another round. The 6th round. The last one. The fear settled out of him briefly, as it always did. That temporary relief that had become the only peace left to him. Somewhere in Crete, something was breathing. Above, Cronus ruled. The Golden Age continued its long, unhurried turning. Harvests full, seasons obedient, the cosmos arranged exactly as he required. He'd swallowed 5 children. He'd swallowed the 6th. The prophecy had been spoken by a broken father who no longer had the power to enforce it, and Cronus had answered it the only way he knew, with his hands and his throat and his certainty. He exhaled for the first time in years. Not peace, exactly, but the closest thing to it a god like him could manage. He didn't know. Deep in a hidden cave in the mountains of Crete, the infant Zeus was alive. Nymphs tended him in the dark, fed him honey, held him against the cave's warmth, kept the secret folded around him like another layer of cloth. And whenever he cried, because infants cry, even divine ones, even ones who'll one day unmake the world, a band of guardians called the Curetes beat their bronze shields together, clashing metal against metal until the sound swallowed his voice whole. The irony was perfect. A child hidden by noise when his father had hidden his fears in silence. He was growing, not quickly by mortal reckoning, but with a steady, unstoppable pace. And somewhere beyond the cave's warmth, a Titaness named Metis, the sharpest mind in the cosmos, the one who could already see the shape of what was coming, was quietly preparing for the moment Zeus would be ready to use it. Cronus held what he believed was the 6th round of a war he'd already won. Below him, in the mountain dark, the actual 6th round was learning how to breathe. Metis knew what needed to happen. She'd always known. That was the particular cruelty of her gift. Not that she could prevent catastrophe, but that she could see its shape from a long way off and spend her time preparing the instrument that would end it. She prepared a potion. Not a weapon, not a poison, something far more precise. Something that would simply ask the body to remember what it had been made to forget. Zeus brought it to his father disguised as a cup of honey wine, and Cronus, king of everything, drank it without suspicion, because he never imagined anyone could reach him. The cup passed between them. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, everything did. The first to return was the stone, expelled whole, unremarkable, exactly as it had gone down. Then Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia, goddess of hearth and warmth, the first swallowed, the one who'd been inside the longest. She came back into the world like a breath finally released. Each return wasn't a miracle. It was a reckoning. The cosmos refusing, one body at a time, to stay in the place where fear had tried to keep it. And with each emergence, Cronus diminished. Not because he was wounded, but because the world he'd tried to hold inside himself was standing outside him now, looking at him, and the size of the gap between what he'd believed and what was actually true had become visible. Every child he'd swallowed he'd kept alive. Every act of prevention had been an act of preservation. He hadn't destroyed his nightmare. He'd incubated it. He'd held it warm and fed it time and handed it back, intact, the moment his grip finally opened. The stone Rhea had placed in his hands, that wrapped bundle, small enough to hold, heavy enough to end a dynasty, hadn't been the deception. He had been the deception. His fear had swallowed his children and called it safety. His certainty had opened his mouth and called it control. And now 6 gods stood in the light, and Cronus understood, for the first time and too late, that the prophecy had never required an enemy. It had only required him. The war that followed wasn't like any war that had come before. No battle lines. No strategies that held for more than a breath. There was only the rage of gods who'd been swallowed alive, finally free, and the exhausted grip of a king who'd spent his entire reign